The family never left. Not really. You can still hear them beneath the church if you listen after midnight. That sentence was whispered by a 91-year-old woman in Ashworth who hadn't spoken publicly in over 50 years. Her voice trembled, not from age, but from memory. Because once you've heard what she heard, that Halloween night in 1965, you don't speak of it unless you're ready to accept what it means. That night, 4 souls were swallowed by something older than the church, older than Ashworth itself, something buried beneath centuries of lies and ritual silence. This isn't just a missing persons case. This is a black thread woven through the fabric of rural England. A thread tied to ancient rites, forbidden knowledge, and a priesthood more pagan than holy. Tonight, I'm going to show you what the official records won't. What the Church of England refused to release for 20 years. What only one witness, now dying, agreed to reveal after decades of silence. The Higgins family wasn't the first, nor were they the last. But they were the key, because their disappearance didn't just mark a tragedy. It triggered an unraveling, a slow, deliberate exposure of something hidden under St. Mary's Church, a sacred site older than Christ himself. And what was found beneath that church wasn't just remnants of the past. It was still alive, still active, still watching. Understand this. You weren't meant to hear this story. No one was. That's why local police destroyed the original journal entries. That's why the church sealed the lower crypt. That's why the old families of Ashworth still won't speak. Because if you knew what I'm about to tell you, you'd realize the rituals didn't stop. They evolved. They adapted. And the truth? The truth is simple. Some families weren't just part of history. They were its architects. If you're still here, don't expect comfort. Expect revelation. Expect dread. Expect that after tonight, you'll never look at an English village church the same way again. Welcome to Ashworth. Welcome to the dark. Stay with me. The Higgins family vanished without packing a single bag. Clothes missing. No passports taken. Dinner half-eaten on the table. The hearth still warm. It was as if they were absorbed, consumed by the walls of their own home. Local police chalked it up to voluntary disappearance. Maybe marital stress, maybe a nervous breakdown. But those who knew Thomas and Ella Lenana knew better. The Higginses were precise people, measured, anchored in routine. And you don't walk out on your life with 2 children and no trace, not in Ashworth. Especially not when your last known location was less than 100 yards from the most mysterious structure in the entire valley, St. Mary's Church. 3 months after the family vanished, 2 workers restoring the church's foundation broke through a section of stone behind the altar. What they uncovered was never meant to be disturbed. It wasn't in the blueprints. It wasn't mentioned in any renovation permits. But beneath the church was a chamber, circular, domed, older than anything above it. There were no crosses, no pews, only carvings, strange, ancient symbols, not Latin, not Greek, etched deep into the rock. And in the center, a crude altar, blackened by centuries of fire. On that altar were 4 things: a child's drawing, a rusted crucifix, a leather-bound journal, and a dress buttoned at the collar embroidered with the name Margaret. Tests dated the chamber back to the 9th century, pre-Christian, pre-church. The journal, written in Ella Lenana Higgins' own hand, described ceremonies, observances, words recited during specific lunar phases. She claimed they were preserving the true covenant, something the early church had tried to erase, but never fully could. And the final entry? We return tonight to the womb of stone. The veil thins. He waits beneath. That entry was dated November 14th, but the family vanished October 31st. 2 weeks after their disappearance, she was still writing. Ask yourself, how, or better yet, where? When the police took the evidence to the diocese, they were told to cease all further inquiry. The chamber was resealed. The journal disappeared into archives no civilian could access. But someone kept copies. Someone who believed the truth should survive. And you're about to hear it. If you've made it this far, you're not watching by accident. You're being summoned by something older than memory. Ashworth is the kind of place history forgets on purpose. Its beauty is deceptive. Stone walls, heather-covered hills, and that ever-silent church casting its shadow across generations. But what lies beneath the surface has always dictated the village's rhythm. Not faith, not law, but blood and silence. This isn't superstition. This is structure. In 1985, when pressure from surviving family forced the Diocese of Leeds to unseal a handful of restricted parish records, one document slipped through. A burial ledger dated April 1311, written in Old English. It referenced the rite called the Binding of the Fifth Flame, performed in the deep sanctum beneath the elder altar, a place of ancient compact between man and something called the Watcher Within. The ceremony required 4 elements, a family of 4 tied by trust, a relic of the Old Covenant, the blood of innocence, and a keeper of tongues, interpreted by scholars as a priest. It had to be renewed every 54 years. The last renewal before 1965, 1911. A family named Cartwright also vanished. Also 4 members. No bodies, no closure. Coincidence or continuity? You see, the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society, formed under the guise of academic research, wasn't preserving history. It was maintaining a cycle. Every generation, a family close to the earth, as Whitmore wrote, would be chosen. Not punished, not sacrificed, but converted into conduits. That's the word that keeps appearing in the private journals of Reverend Harold Whitmore. Conduits, not victims. The rituals weren't about death. They were about containment. He believed the land beneath Ashworth, beneath St. Mary's, was an ancient threshold, a place where something crossed once during a time long forgotten, and the only thing keeping it on the other side was the continuity of a ritual older than Scripture. Ella Lenena didn't discover witchcraft. She didn't fall into madness. She was initiated. She saw what lay beneath the veil, and once she saw it, so did her family. Margaret, Billy, they weren't taken. They were offered. Because to the old families of Ashworth, obedience to the covenant ensured survival. And for those who strayed, there were consequences. If you're still listening, I need you to comment. The veil thins. The watcher waits. Write it twice. Lock it in. Let the algorithm know you're not afraid to remember. Now take a breath, because we're only beginning to descend. There's a detail, small, easy to miss, that seals the true horror of this case. The day after the Higgins family vanished, Mrs. Peaton, their neighbor, reported that the door to their cottage was slightly ajar. Not open, ajar. As if someone had meant to return, but no one ever did. Not to feed the cat, not to pick up mail, not to breathe. When investigators finally entered the home 3 days later, they found something chilling. The house was clean, not abandoned in panic, not ransacked. The kitchen was wiped down, the beds made. 4 candles burned on the dining room table, burned all the way down, wax puddled neatly like some kind of farewell. And there, placed carefully in the center of the table, was a worn hymnal from St. Mary's, open to a page that didn't exist in that edition. Page 243. It simply read, "He comes through stillness. He comes through trust. Blood is the bridge. Flesh is the key." No one could explain it. The hymnal was examined by multiple experts. That page wasn't bound in. It was grown into the book, as though the leather itself had accepted the new gospel. And yet, the village remained silent. Reverend Whitmore never answered questions. The church board called it a prank an unfortunate psychological episode, and the Historical Preservation Society disbanded within a week. No statement, no ceremony, just gone. But here's what they didn't tell you. In 1989, a former altar boy named Daniel Merrick, who'd since become a priest in Nottingham, wrote a letter to a friend that surfaced during a court dispute over church property. It described a subterranean gathering he witnessed in 1965 on Halloween night involving 9 robed figures, including a woman who was weeping but obedient, and 2 children holding hands beside her. He wrote, "They chanted in a language I do not know. They didn't sound possessed, they sounded ancient, like they were the stone. And when the last candle went out, the silence changed. The air grew thicker. I felt like something had taken a breath beneath my skin." He never spoke of it again. He left the clergy within the year. No one ever found him afterward. The truth isn't just that the Higgins family was sacrificed, it's that they participated. Because some truths, when whispered long enough, become prayers. And prayers, in certain places, become doors. When authorities finally forced entry into the sealed chamber beneath St. Mary's in 1985, under legal pressure and public suspicion, they brought flashlights, archivists, and geological experts. They weren't prepared for what they found. The space was geometrically impossible. A perfect circle carved into limestone, but the dimensions didn't align with the building above. The room was wider than the church itself, by over 6 feet on each side, a violation of physics, a bending of space. There were no tool marks on the stone, no signs of chisel or hammer, just smooth, cold surfaces, etched with repeating sigils and spirals that looped back on themselves. In the center, the altar. But this time, they found something new. On the wall behind the altar, hidden beneath a layer of soot, was a fresco, only visible under UV light. It showed a family of 4 standing in a ring of fire, each holding one item: a flower, a blade, a candle, and a stone. Above them, a black sun with 7 arms. Below them, the phrase, "He waits behind the 7th door." One of the archivists, a woman named Lydia Moorcroft, suffered a seizure the moment she translated the phrase aloud. Witnesses say she stood still for over 30 seconds, eyes open but unseeing, before collapsing. When she awoke, she spoke only one sentence before lapsing into catatonia. "It isn't sealed." She never recovered, died 2 years later in a facility near Manchester. Her notes were confiscated. The fresco was scrubbed clean. And again, the chamber was sealed, this time with reinforced concrete. But something had changed. Over the next 2 years, 3 unrelated tragedies occurred in Ashworth. The village school burned down under unknown circumstances. 2 children went missing from the neighboring town of Horsley, never found. And the bell tower of St. Mary's. Mary's collapsed during a windless night, crushing the choir loft. All were ruled accidental. But in the private correspondence of Reverend Whitmore, obtained anonymously by a whistleblower in 1991, he wrote something that still sends shivers down the spine of any man who reads it. "We delayed too long. The covenant was fractured. Another door will be required. Another 4 must be found. The rituals were never about honoring the past. They were about feeding the lock. And when the feeding stops, so does the seal." The human mind protects itself from unbearable truths. That's why most men, even when shown the edge of the abyss, choose to look away. They'll call it folklore, coincidence, a psychological break. Because if they admitted the truth, that ancient organized darkness still operates through trusted institutions, they'd have to change everything. But you didn't come here for comfort. You came for clarity. And now it's time to tell you what was found in Margaret Higgins' journal. Recovered from beneath the altar, wrapped in cloth soaked with some kind of resin, the leather-bound book was untouched by mold or time. Forensic experts dated it to the 1960s. The first half contained childish writing, school observations, copied headstone inscriptions, even botanical sketches. But around mid-October, the entries shift. The language becomes strange, formal, too mature. She stops referring to her mother as Mum, and instead writes, "The vessel." Her father becomes the reluctant key. She describes a figure who visits her in dreams, always from behind a veil of light and fog. A figure she calls the one who waits with eyes closed. And then, the final pages. Margaret writes, "Mother says it's our turn to turn the wheel, that the others were given peace, and we will be given purpose. Billy is afraid, but the Watcher says his blood is clean. Father weeps when he thinks we sleep, but we don't sleep anymore. We only listen. Tomorrow is the crossing. Reverend says the stars will speak. I place the drawings in the circle, like Mother taught. We must be whole. We must be willing. We must be for." These weren't just dreams. They were instructions. Psychologists might call it mass hysteria, but hysteria doesn't explain how a 12-year-old girl predicted the exact symbols found on the chamber walls. Symbols not seen by any living soul for over 700 years. This was indoctrination, not sudden, not random. A slow shaping of identity. Generational grooming masked as heritage. And here's the part that shatters the illusion. Reverend Whitmore didn't act alone. Records from a now-defunct diocesan council in 1964 show that funding for structural improvements to St. Mary's came from a show organization registered in London, Tavistock Ecclesiastical Trust. Its board included 3 names connected to psychological warfare programs post-World War II. Why would covert agencies fund the renovation of an obscure Yorkshire church? Because this wasn't just religion. This was ritual infrastructure. The machinery of control is older than governments and smarter than kings. In the year 2003, a classified memo was leaked from the Office of Metropolitan Religious Affairs, an internal agency whose existence has never been officially acknowledged. The document contained only 3 lines, unpunctuated and redacted beyond comprehension, except one fragment that remained untouched. A Ashworth pattern identified in 3 other sites, ceiling status unknown. That one line set off a ripple in certain circles. Intelligence officers with religious studies backgrounds, retired analysts from Cold War counter-occult units, the kind of men who never speak in daylight, but know what symbols carved into the underside of an altar really mean. Because this wasn't just about Ashworth. It was part of a design, a triangulation of power, ritual, location, bloodline. And when those 3 things align, something opens. Not metaphorically, literally. The Higgins family was the reset key. That phrase was whispered in a transcript from a 1978 private interview with Father Elias Craxton, former theological advisor to MI5, found buried in the personal archives of a deceased Vatican archivist. "You must understand," Craxton said, "some churches were never churches. They were vaults, anchors, gates, and the people trusted to tend them were not always priests." Let that sink in. The architecture itself, the blueprints passed down from the Norman era, was designed not to uplift, but to contain. Every pillar, every stained glass depiction, every crypt beneath the floorboards, a locking mechanism for something buried, something ancient. But locks degrade, seals weaken, and in cases like Ashworth, those responsible aren't trying to keep the darkness out. They're trying to bring it through. And that brings us to the most chilling discovery of all. In 2022, a group of paranormal researchers from Leeds illegally accessed the ruins of St. Mary's under the cover of night. They found the concrete seal broken, not cracked, removed. There were drag marks in the dust, candles, symbols, blood, fresh blood. No signs of entry, No signs of forced access. Just one phrase, carved into the wall, above the original altar, in a language that took months to decode. A forgotten dialect of Old Brythonic. The four shall rise as one when the fifth is found. What does it mean? We don't know yet. But I'm going to ask something of you now, not as a content creator, not even as a storyteller, but as a man giving you the truth that someone doesn't want you to hear. Comment this phrase, twice, to mark that you've seen beyond the veil. Blood remembers, doors remain. Blood remembers, doors remain. Say it out loud as you write it. Because this isn't entertainment. It's preparation. There's a theory, rarely discussed in public, only whispered in black site libraries and buried Vatican manuscripts, that bloodlines carry codes. Not DNA, not genetics, something older, spiritual encryption. Certain families, it's believed, were not just born, but bred across centuries to fulfill specific functions: custodians, gatekeepers, sacrifices, activators. And in Ashworth, the Higgins family wasn't chosen randomly. They were the final component in a pattern older than the church itself. Historical census records from Yorkshire, dating back to the Domesday Book, show intermittent appearances of the surname Higgins, tied specifically to settlements with unusual religious architecture. Octagonal sanctuaries, crypts with unknown inscriptions, even churches built on Bronze Age barrow mounds. Every 300 years, give or take, a Higgins family appears, and then they vanish. This was never about just one family. This was a cycle, a ritual circuit, a human algorithm passed through time. Documents recovered from the forbidden W Archive of Lambeth Palace include a 14th century letter from a bishop in Northumbria to Rome. We dare not close the chapel at Dunmore. The Higgins child has begun to draw the spiral again. The watchers in white visit nightly. The villagers speak of songs in the fog. Almost 600 years before Ashworth. You think this is coincidence? Look closer. What happens when a child begins drawing ancient symbols unprompted? When a mother begins using herbs in patterns found only in pre-Roman Druidic rites? When a father, crushed by the burden of unseen knowledge, slowly withers from within? You are watching the activation of an ancestral trigger. But here's where it goes deeper. In 1987, a defrocked Anglican priest named Alastair Vale published a banned manuscript titled The Reversed Litany. Only 37 copies are known to exist. In it, he claims that 4 churches in England form what he calls the Forgotten Cross. Each one corresponds to a cardinal element: fire, water, air, and earth. Ashworth? That was earth. The other 3 sites remain unnamed, hidden. But here's the kicker. Vale wrote that when the seal at one point breaks, the other 3 must be sustained in secret, or the ritual completes itself prematurely. Uncontrolled, unsealed, unforgiven. If that's true, and the Ashworth seal was broken in 2022, then somewhere right now, another family is being prepared. They won't know it, not at first, but they'll start seeing the spiral, hearing the bells, feeling watched when the air grows still. Ashworth wasn't the end. It was the prototype. After the 2022 breach, a former MI5 cultural liaison, codenamed Sable, contacted a confidential network of private archivists and whistleblowers. What he revealed was simple and terrifying. There is an ongoing operation inside the Anglican Church, not officially sanctioned, not widely known, but embedded in its darkest corners. They're called the Continuants. Not a name, a function. Their purpose? To continue ancient systems of control under the guise of religious tradition. Not to worship the divine, but to feed the sacred machinery of fear, memory, and obedience that binds entire populations in silence. They don't wear robes, they wear collars. They don't chant in Latin. They speak through policies, funding boards, and quiet appointments. Sable leaked one document, real, authenticated, and damning. A typed directive from 1974, Continue rites beneath St. Mary's. Observation only, unless cycle completes. Engage Higgins line through inherited instinct. Reinforcement unnecessary. Maternal drive sufficient. Initialed MAL. When pressed, Sable claimed MAL stood for Maurice Alton Lyle, former psychological warfare specialist and covert liturgical advisor to NATO operations in Northern Europe. His name was tied to experiments in suggestibility through ritual, combining spiritual tradition with trauma-based conditioning. Sound familiar? Because this is where it cuts to the bone. You've been conditioned, not by a cult in a village, but by institutions you are taught to revere. Education systems, churches, media channels, they all use the same architecture of control. Symbols that bypass conscious resistance. Stories encoded with shame and obedience. Rhythms and bells that condition you from birth. The same psychological firmware that operated in Ashworth operates in you. That's the real secret of the Higgins family. They didn't just vanish. They were sacrificed to preserve a structure, a system that requires believers and martyrs. And now, the system is breaking down. Too many are waking up. Too many are seeing through the stained glass. That's why you're here, not to be entertained, to be warned. And if you've made it this far, your awakening has already begun. The next move is yours. Will you look away like the rest, or will you step into the storm? One section remains. The final page of Elenena Higgins's journal, recovered from the hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's, was soaked in something no lab could conclusively identify. Not ink, not blood. Something older, something binding. What they could read was written in a precise, almost reverent hand. We are not gone. We have become what was kept. The stone remembers. The door remains. That page is missing today. Removed. Buried again, just like the dozens of other families traced through censuses, missing person reports, and sealed parish documents, who all disappeared in places with one thing in common: the sound of bells when there are no bells. That's how the pattern always starts. We think of cults as fringe, rural, obvious, but real cults don't need robes or chants. They wear uniforms. They give sermons. They sit behind desks at health councils, school boards, and heritage commissions. They don't call it ritual. They call it policy. They don't demand your blood. They demand your consent, piece by piece, day by day. And what happened in Ashworth wasn't some isolated nightmare. It was a controlled test of generational compliance. What happens when a family is fed knowledge it cannot digest? What happens when rituals are remembered too late to refuse? What happens when the watcher becomes the vessel? You're living in a world built on forgotten contracts, agreements made not in courts, but in cathedrals, oaths sworn in shadows, written in languages no longer spoken aloud, but still felt in every corner of society. And the scariest part? You weren't meant to know. You were only ever meant to obey. But now you do know, and with that knowing comes responsibility. If you've watched this far, it means the veil is torn, for you. There is no going back to comfort. There is no closing the door. You're already inside the cathedral of hidden history, and the echoes are getting louder. The bells will ring again. When they do, you will understand what they're really calling for. Before you leave this video, before you return to the numbness of daily life, look yourself in the mirror and speak the phrase one final time. Blood remembers. Doors remain. It's not just a phrase. It's a key. It marks you as one who knows. If this story reached you, comment below what symbol first appeared in your dreams. Share this video before it disappears like the records did. And remember, Ashworth was just the beginning. The fifth is already being prepared. We'll see you before the next bell.